This is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about the genius of Lincoln. There's many sides to Abraham Lincoln. There's so many fascinating parts of him. There's the good parts of him, the bad parts, the unknown parts. There's so much about Lincoln that we don't understand, as I've said before. But I want to talk about his genius, because you have to look at it that way. He had a wonderful sense of understanding his fellow human beings. He understood humanity. Well, he had suffered a lot as a kid. He went through some really rough times. His father had sold him out to do farm work, which he hated. He hated manual labor. He just totally hated it. And also, there was no love lost between him and his father. None at all. In fact, when his father was dying, he refused to come. He said there would be nothing to do. Why bother? I mean, there was just nothing that they could say to each other that could make the situation better. Lincoln was very, very well known in the law circuit. He would travel around, of course, and stop at general stores and barbershops, people's homes, and stop for dinner. And he would always be the center of the show because he would always tell great stories. He was a phenomenal storyteller. And I wanted to share with you two of Lincoln's stories that I remember reading about. And the first was about a gentleman went to see a show. And he went into a theater. It was not very carefully filled at that time to watch. Sat down, took his top hat off and put it in the seat next to him. And a rather large lady came walking in, went right to his aisle, and sat down in the seat right next to him, right on top of his hat, with a resounding crash. And he looked at the lady and said, "Madam, I could have told you it wouldn't fit." That was one of his jokes. The other was dealing with a judge. I don't recall the judge's name. But he said that he was walking down the street to go to the courthouse, and the judge's carriage came by. And the judge said, "Lincoln, you want to ride?" And he said, "Sure, Judge." And he hopped in, and the carriages was going a little bit to the left, and going a little bit to the right, and bumping into the curb. And Lincoln turned to the judge and said, "Judge, I think your driver's drunk." And the judge said, "Lincoln, you're right." And he leaned out the window and yelled at the driver, "You scoundrel, you're drunk." And with that, the carriage stopped. And the Irish driver leaned over and said, "Begorra, that's the first correct decision you've made this year." And that was the kind of stories he would tell, stuff like that. And there were so many other ones. I always remember there was a story of the naked lady on the horse, but he got interrupted, never got to finish it. That would have been an interesting one to hear, because a lot of his stories were bawdy. Yeah, polite society didn't record them, but he got a bunch of guys together, and he would tell them some pretty, fun, crazy stories. And he was good at that. And I think it was very good therapy for him because he was naturally a very depressed, down guy. And if he had an audience, he was always happy. He loved companionship. He loved company. He enjoyed the company of men much more. He felt very awkward around women. When he was courting Mary Todd, who he said that God only has one D in his name, but the Todds needed two. He said, "I'd love to dance with you in the worst way." And she said, "You have," when they danced. I mean, he wasn't a dancer. He was very awkward in many respects in social scenes. He didn't like it. He was uncomfortable in it. But you know something? The genius of Lincoln was the fact that he was able to take what little experience he had. Militarily, he had hardly anything. He said he had fought in the Black Hawk War and spent more time fighting mosquitoes than anything else. But he checked out books from the Library of Congress on warfare and military operations and various things. And he was a good study. And he worked very, very hard. And he became a very competent war leader. Now, he made a lot of mistakes and made a lot of good decisions. And he was willing to own up to a lot of his mistakes, not all of them, though. One thing that's kind of fascinating is that he really lost it. He got really super angry. And once again, he had a hell of a temper, which he learned to control. But he lost it a little bit after Gettysburg. Because after Gettysburg, which was pretty much a Union victory, because it basically stopped the South from its northern invasion, that Lee's shattered army had to work its way all the way down, and they were stopped because there was a lot of flooding going on, and they couldn't get across a lot of the rivers. And Lincoln said, this was your time to finish off Lee's army. Told to Meade, the general, and the general said, we have routed the rebels. He said, destroy them. And he was right. Lincoln was completely correct on that. Had Meade gone and attacked Lee at that point, it could have had a profound effect on the war, because the war dragged on a very long, long time. Much due to Lincoln, as well as some of the generals that he put into power. Lincoln's the only president to have a patent. Very important. It was for flotation devices for flatboats. You notice that they got stuck on sandbars, and so he had extra flotation pieces that would go into the water and raise up the draft of the flatboat. Very smart. He was fascinated with technology. He was fascinated with invention. And it was fortunate that we had him in the White House at that time when the Civil War was going on, because he pushed for better guns, and he would take them in the backyard and test them out himself. And when we came to the time of the Virginia, which was the ironclad being made by the South, when news came, he met with a lot of people trying to come up with something, and Erickson, of course, came and said he could make a ship in 100 days. And Lincoln said, do it. They ordered 3 different types of ironclad. The most successful was the Monitor, but it was made in 100 days. It had some issues, but it saved the Union fleet. It's a pity in many respects that we don't know Lincoln as well as we should. I mean, there's a lot to like about him and a lot to be a little concerned about sometimes. I mean, his emotional state sometimes was a little troublesome. And it's a fascinating thing also that many times people kind of sat there and saw him just kind of babbling along by himself. When he was, before he was president, he would look at mirrors and talk to the mirror sometimes. And actually, he looked in the mirror and saw 2 reflections, which he said that if he did get elected, he would serve 1 term and he would die in the second. He was a big follower of dreams. He felt dreams were very important, and dreams told you everything you needed to know about life in many respects. And it's interesting, his dreams were very vivid. The unfortunate part of Lincoln is that so little of his writings exist. Now, there's a lot of writings of Lincoln, but a good deal of it's all formal. It's government writing. It's formal letters to individuals. It's not Lincoln with his feet up on the bench and sitting there writing and saying, hey, buddy, I want to tell you all about, that kind of stuff. We don't have much of anything like that. Very little. All the letters of his to his wife were burned. Probably by Robert. Robert Lincoln burned a lot of his father's papers. He was stopped from doing it, but Lord knows how much he had destroyed already. What still exists gives us an image of Lincoln, but takes away a lot of the the flaws, the problems, the things that were going on, the personal stuff. And that's unfortunate because it's hard to get to know someone or understand someone without understanding their personality. And while we do understand Lincoln's personality, we're missing chunks of it. And I think if we had those chunks, if I can put it that way, I think we would have a far better understanding of Lincoln and maybe a greater appreciation of Lincoln. I mean, you can't really appreciate him more in many respects. I mean, we have created the Lincoln that never existed, let's be honest. The Lincoln that exists in our modern world, we don't think of Lincoln as Lincoln truly was. I like to see Lincoln warts and all. I like to see the bad part, the good part, the wonderful part, the frightening part. That gives you a chance to understand. And you need that to understand the full person. Because no matter what, if you're missing parts of a person's story, you can never truly explain them. And they can't explain themselves to you historically. And I still think that there was a deliberate nature on Lincoln's part to do that. How did Edison get in there? Interesting thing also to mention is that his cabinet thought him basically a dull rube and treated him as such. Seward, his Secretary of State, said, "Hey, I'll make all the decisions and you just sign the papers, you know." Lincoln quickly told him what to do with that idea. Salmon Chase just could not tolerate Lincoln. He thought he was just an uneducated boob. And I'm not quite sure that his opinion of Lincoln ever truly changed. Chase was somewhat of an elitist. And the thing about him is the fact that he always wanted to be president very badly. And he wanted to challenge Lincoln in 1864. And so Lincoln had the wonderful opportunity to have an opening in the Supreme Court, and he nominated Chase to be Chief Justice. And so the very aspiring Chase jumped at it. And it's good he did, because he would not have been able to defeat Lincoln. I don't think so. Although Lincoln was vulnerable, very much so, in 1864. But once the battle started changing, once you had all the victories, once you had Grant in place and Sherman in the South, things started changing. And Lincoln's star started to change. Also, you have to remember, you have the soldier vote. And you can be quite sure that a vast majority, if not all, the soldiers were voting for Lincoln because they had to submit their papers and whatever to their superiors. I'm sure there was some tampering going on there. Who knows? But it was warfare. And it was the only election taking place during a civil war, if you think about it. And who was running against Lincoln in 1864? McClellan, who had been the general before. And McClellan was an ass. I'm sorry. He was great at training. He was phenomenal at coming up with pamphlets and booklets. I'm going to share one with you in a couple of days. But also, he had this arrogance that was beyond the pall. And he wrote letters, whereas Lincoln's letters were all destroyed. Mrs. McClellan saved all of her husbands, which she shouldn't have, because it just shows what a complete and total bigoted asshole McClellan was. And what he had to say about Lincoln was frightening. And he just would not listen to Lincoln. And Lincoln fired him once and then brought him back and then fired him again. In fact, when he said that McClellan said to Lincoln his horses were fatigued, and Lincoln would write back, "Fatigued from what? What have you done?" And Lincoln was very, very upset with McClellan. And then he went through a series of generals that which were not working to his advantage because they didn't think like Lincoln. And that's why Grant was so very important, because he understood Lincoln and Lincoln understood him, and they spoke a similar language. And that's very important. And that's how the war was finally done. But Lincoln, amazing individual. I wanted to try to show the various sides of him and talk about him and things that he did. He was faced with a situation that was probably worse than anyone in the American presidency has ever dealt with. And he had to handle it. And he hardly knew what to do in the beginnings. And you can see the little mistakes he made here. But as he aged and as he went through the presidency, he grew in stature and understanding. Even the way he wrote, he understood. If you read his writings before the presidency, he doesn't really put a lot of religion into his writing. But by the time you get to the second inaugural, he's starting to sound like a biblical prophet. I mean, he is really going to town. And he understood that because that reached the common man. That's why he did it. And the interesting thing is that Lincoln grew in stature, and he was assassinated. The light just went out for some reason. And he was assassinated on April 14th, died April 15th, 1865. And from that moment on, he took on mythic statures. I mean, he was basically godlike within a short time. He died, he was shot on Good Friday, and at Easter Sunday, every pulpit was talking about Father Abraham. And as time has gone by over the various century now and a half, Lincoln has totally become and transformed into a god. In the pantheon of American gods, you have George Washington. You might find that the God figure and the Christ figure was often pushed as Lincoln, who died for the sins of the nation. That's how it was said on many a pulpit. And of course, as time went by, Lincoln became greater and greater and greater and greater and greater. And suddenly Lincoln started saying things that Lincoln never ever said. But the thing is, Lincoln was an amazing individual. Yes, as I've tried to do this, I'm trying to show different parts of Lincoln and what I'm talking about. Yes, he could be cold as ice. Yes, he could be very awkward around people. But he was brilliant. Give him a pen, give him a piece of paper, and give him a lot of time, because he worked very methodically and slowly. And he would come up with masterpieces. That's how Seward and he finally started working together. Seward would come up with great ideas, and then Lincoln would turn them into poetry and bring them to fruition. There's so much about Lincoln. There's so many different things about him that are fascinating and interesting. And I did one before, as I said, that was a little bit more negative. I did one that was a little bit more quizzical, and this one's a little bit more positive. I want to do one more on Lincoln and talk about some of the other aspects of him and his understandings and his personality, which is a difficult thing because, as I said before, we're missing so much information on Lincoln. In some respects, it's sort of like when they talked about Christopher Columbus years ago, that they were putting up a statue of him, and they said any statue works because we don't know what he looked like. And with Lincoln, in many respects, we know what he looked like. He was very, very fond of photography because he knew it was good to work with the common man who was advertising. He also understood that what he did wasn't loved by a lot of people. He was hated by a lot of people. But some of the things that he did during the Civil War were pretty amazing and pretty frightening. And that's the last chapter of which I wanted to talk about with Lincoln, some of his actions during the Civil War. And that's about all I have to say right now. And thank you very much.